Scott Monroe. I'm the managing editor for the Maine Trust for Local News, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight to another edition of Maine Voices Live. Tonight's host is Megan Gray. Megan is an arts and culture reporter at the Portland Press-Herald. A Midwest native, she moved to Maine in 2016. She's written about presidential politics and local government, jury trials and jails, and most recently a great piece on different types of cheeses to pack for your summer outings. Megan has also written about our guest tonight, Theresa Secord. Theresa is a traditional Penobscot basket maker, and she is the founding director of the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance. After earning a master's degree in geology, Theresa returned to Maine to work for her tribe, heading up a mineral assessment program on 300,000 acres of Penobscot and Passamaquoddy lands. Her work is featured in private collections and museums throughout the nation. And earlier this year, as Megan reported, she was honored with a $100,000 Ruth Arts Fellowship and a United States Artist Fellowship and a Cultural Capital Fellow. So let's get tonight's discussion going. Welcome to the stage, Megan and Theresa.
Thank you so much for being here on this absolutely beautiful June evening. It's really fitting that we're here tonight at Colby because the very first time that I spoke to Theresa, I think for a story, I was looking back, was in 2023 in advance of an exhibition here at the Colby College Museum of Art. And I was new to writing about art and still learning the beat, and Theresa was just so kind and generous with her knowledge and her perspective on the exhibition, on her own art, on Wabanaki basketry, and I have been grateful to speak with her on different occasions since then. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Well, let's jump right in and talk a little bit first about basket making and your earliest memories of this art form. Who taught you? What was this like when you were growing up?
Well, I always start with saying where I grew up, which is South Portland, Maine. I was born in Portland. And we used to travel to the reservation on Indian Island, Maine, where my mother was born, a lot in the summers and a lot of holidays. And so I watched my great-grandmother weaving baskets, and that's really how I first started, becoming interested in seeing the tradition. My mother, like many of her generation, had actually gone to Mercy School of Nursing in Portland because she went to Catholic high school in Bangor, as did a lot of Penobscot girls, and Passamaquoddy women as well had been sent to the Sisters of Mercy. It was the same connected network there. And so I found out later that a lot of my peers, grew up. A lot of my Passamaquoddy and Penobscot friends also, our mothers were nurses and met our dads in Portland. And so I'm the first in my family to be born off the reservation.
Wow. And when you were growing up, what was the status of basket making? Who was keeping the tradition alive at that time?
Yeah, even then it was mostly elderly, and I remember too when we would make that long trek, and this is like pre-interstate, to Indian Island. It's like 150 miles. We would, one of us, me or my 5 brothers, would run into the house and grab the paper bag full of these B&M baked bean jars, because the older basket makers used to weave around those. And so that was all part of like being a little bit engaged in the culture and the basket making early on. But I definitely saw a lot of basket making activity. You could see the men working the trees and pounding the ash logs and making the baskets when we were there on the reservation. And a lot of basket makers were selling from their homes at that time. And it would say like Indian baskets for sale. And I think there was a picture of my great-grandmother there in 1953 selling her baskets on Indian Island. But then when I went to work for my tribe is when I could see that things had really changed.
Yeah, you left Maine to study geology. What brought you back, and how did that bring you back to basket making?
Well, I was finishing up a master's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that was right after the Maine Indian land claims. And so our tribe acquired, together with the Passamaquoddy tribe, that 300,000 acres. And literally, the tribal administrator for our tribe called up all of the professionals that were getting degrees and invited us to come back and work for the tribe. And my mother thought that was astounding because the demographic migration, as I said before, it was always in Maine, from like northern Maine to southern Maine to the jobs. Like, she couldn't conceive that I would go get a graduate degree in Wisconsin and then go work up in the north again. She just couldn't understand that. And then I met my teacher there on Indian Island in a language class. I was studying the Penobscot language and really interested in the culture because I had been there quite a bit as a kid on Indian Island. I grew up again with those 5 brothers, and my mother, that would be my chance to get away, and I would get to go visit my grandparents by myself. And they couldn't handle
escape.
Yeah, and they couldn't handle the 5 boys. So I got to have some real close contact with the culture that way.
Yeah. Tell me a little more about your teacher.
Oh, she was a really great woman. I think there's a photo of me with her husband that will be coming up there. Her name was Madeline Tomer Shay. And sadly, when she passed away in 1993, she would become known as the last person born speaking the Penobscot language.
Wow.
And there's been quite a revival, since then. And there's still a lot of Passamaquoddy speakers in a continuous line of language, but I met her in a language class, but soon became really interested in the baskets she was making and asked her if I could work with her, and I did for 5 years.
Wow,
And
what
so
a treasure that must have been.
Yeah, it was a great time. It's like a time that you can't get back. It's like before kids and everything too. Get to do whatever you want. I'm working as a geologist.
Learn new skills.
Yeah, and doing that. But then I was really distracted by the basketry too, and went on to work with a lot of basket makers.
So in 1993, Wabanaki basket makers realized that there were fewer than a dozen weavers younger than 50 statewide. You co-founded the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance to preserve that traditional knowledge. That work helped increase the number of basket makers and lower the average age of people practicing the traditional craft. What made that shift possible? How did it happen?
Well, it was really with the help of the state folklorist at the time, Kathleen Mundell, who had seeded this traditional arts apprenticeship program at the state arts agency, the Maine Arts Commission. And so I actually became a formal apprentice with my teacher in that program in 1988, I think. And she also was working with basket makers at the Holton Band of Maliseet, the Aroostook Band of Micmac, the Passamaquoddy tribe. And all the basket makers were getting quite elderly. I think there were about 55 founding members in the Basketmakers Alliance. And having all the same problems like access to the wood. At that time, the ash was in a dieback, which is a different scientific thing with drought and flood freeze was what the foresters were calling it. So they were having a hard time finding quality wood then. And then the market had really, the market was really low. So people were having a hard time getting good prices for the baskets, compared to the amount of effort that they put into it. And there weren't a lot of young people who wanted to learn. So, those all things conspired. And she invited me, the state folklorist, to help bring together the basket makers to talk about this. And that ended up being the first meeting of the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance. And I headed that for 21 years. And we went ahead with that traditional arts apprenticeship program that she had seeded, and we took on even more mentors. And again, these are all, there's one now elderly, the late Angela Barnes teaching. So, I'd be writing the grants to fund her to teach her granddaughter. The one-on-one transmission, of intergenerational knowledge that had traditionally happened in the tribes in the past, but had fallen apart. That structure and fabric had fallen apart. And there's a tribal community basketry workshop. This is helpful. Those pictures are 100 years apart, and the young girl is from the Passamaquoddy tribe in one of our workshops. And so we'd have these, so along with the apprenticeships, we'd have these tribal community basketry workshops where as many as 20 teachers from all 4 federally recognized tribes would come and teach up to like 80 community members in a weekend. Everything from pounding the ash log to the finished basket. And this was where a young apprentice could meet their teacher and ask them to, you know, over, like you're eating moose stew together or something, or you're learning to make a basket, you know, in a formal workshop. Whereas otherwise, a person interested in making baskets isn't gonna go knock on the door of an elderly basket maker and say, will you teach me how to make baskets?
Yeah, it seems intimidating.
Yeah, and then the third piece is the markets, and this is just so timely that they're running this way. And so we reestablished this ancient selling that the people had been doing for 200 years. And I think one of the early photos, some of you may have seen, is basket makers selling in 1860 on Mount Kineo. And that was the earliest photo I had up there, which again is like really historic, where the people had plugged into this like cottage economy of basketry. So we reconnected. That was a store that we had also in Old Town for 8 years as part of our kind of massive effort, you know, on all fronts. The teaching, the apprenticing, and it takes someone like 5 years to become proficient enough to sell something, you know, that was pretty good. And, you know, and then this art gallery where we were selling all the baskets of the basket makers. We sold the first baskets that Jeremy Frey made here. And, you know, he came into our programs right at that time when it was important, you know, and our work was really energized, and we had a lot of momentum. And then Sarah Sockbeeson also she was living on the reservation. That was just like a half a mile from the bridge on Indian Island. And she was living on the reservation and with her mother and walking across the bridge to sell us baskets that didn't even have covers on them yet.
Wow.
And so, you know, this was like a good timing that, you know, generation came into all this work and all these programs.
So more than 30 years later, where do you see the status of basket making today? You've mentioned some, you know, Jeremy and Sarah. Who are some of the artists that you're really excited about right now?
Well, you know,
what is the landscape?
Well, the landscape is kind of difficult again, you know, with funding and, you know, also with the emerald ash borer beetle. And so it's exciting that we brought forward this new generation of basket makers, and you know, some are doing really well. Like again, you know, thinking about Jeremy Frey, I don't know how many of you saw his solo show last year, and actually I'm traveling to Connecticut tomorrow to his opening. It traveled to the Art Institute of Chicago after the Portland Museum of Art, and tomorrow it opens at the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut. And then it's going to California after that. And so, you know, he was really, you know, an innovator in the art. And I don't know, it's really exciting too to see the styles that people are making today. I always tell people that, because some people have looked at our baskets and said, well, you know, how are they different from, you know, years ago? And I tell people that we were weaving our grandparents' baskets, you know, when Jeremy Frey came along. I mean, he kind of busted out of that mold. And even the elders who were teaching us basket making, myself included, they were weaving what their grandparents wove, you know, and I still do, you know, 1800 styles. But so he did so much innovating, and he still is, you know, he's exploring doing some weaving in metal next. He's going to visit a foundry, he told me, after the show opens tomorrow. He's going to a foundry in New York. And, but he really set the standard too for setting goals in terms of marketing and getting his work shown in museums. And so that's what the landscape is today. I think, it's kind of divergence. I wish there were more programs for young people making baskets. There aren't as many as there used to be. There are a few. The Passamaquoddy tribe and the Holton Band of Maliseets have a little regular program, but it's not as big an effort as it was when we were all together as an alliance, which is kind of too bad.
You mentioned Jeremy, and I still think all the time about some of the baskets that were included in that show. There was one that was sort of a very traditional form and undyed on the outside, and like vibrant like reds and purples woven on the inside, just in these incredible intricate weaves, and it still comes to my mind all the time. It's really beautiful work. I wonder, you mentioned some of the impact that he's had in his own work. How do you think his solo show at the Portland Museum of Art, some of the large prizes he's won and recognitions he's received, has impacted the landscape for other Wabanaki basket makers?
Yeah, well, it's just really been astounding, his rise. His prices are, over the top, like amazing. I don't know if people realize his baskets sell for upwards of $80,000 and $100,000 each now. And so, I mean, again, thinking about the founders of the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance, they would not believe it. I mean, they're all gone now, but they would be like in shock. And but also, like, he set goals for himself and for others that we can all aspire to. Like, for a long time, and we're still really good friends. And I've been kind of known as his professional development mentor. Like, his mother taught him to weave the baskets through the programs of the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance. And she's a great basket maker too, Gal Frey, a friend of mine. And she learned from the great Sylvia Gabriel, who was a founding board member of the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance and did all those white porcupine points. And you can see her style still in his baskets, which is really amazing. And she was in the first Maine Arts Commission Traditional Arts Apprenticeship Program. But where's he going? Yeah, so
you got Jeremy his first check, right?
I did. Yeah, actually, he was in a workshop. One of the workshops where we brought the teachers in, and he was splitting the wood for us. And I wrote him a $50 check, and the rest is history. He does credit that as kind of his first. I mean, he had been selling little baskets to the tribe, on the side and stuff when his mother was teaching him. And and he was in a difficult place too at that time, which he's also shared. But so we started sending the basket makers out into the national juried Native American art markets in Santa Fe and in Phoenix. And, he started winning big really fast, and so his work is just exquisite. And so and I nominated him for some fellowships that he received, and it helped us too. It helped us with our funding, because we were supported by the Ford Foundation and other Maine foundations and federal National Endowment for the Arts. And so having a success story like him was really helpful, and others. And he was kind of the first to do all these breakout innovative styles and forms. But then I would say it was about 10 years ago, he started talking about having a solo show. And I remember saying to myself, well, good luck with that, because our baskets weren't really shown in fine art museums 10 years ago. Our baskets were in ethnographic museums, and our basket makers are really making names for themselves out in this Native American art world. In fact, when the Portland Museum of Art invited 4 of us to have our baskets in the Portland Biennial in 2015, some of the painters, from New York who were often in that show were really upset by that and didn't understand it and thought, wow, what are these baskets doing here? And, the curator said, this is the oldest art form in Maine, and these guys are like famous out in New Mexico and other places. I mean, Jeremy had won the top prize in the juried Santa Fe Indian Market among 1,000 Native American artists from all over the country. And I mean, that was 2011, and that was really when things started to happen for him. And a collector slept all night in his booth out on the plaza in Santa Fe to buy his basket for, at that time, that was an astounding $15,000. And the prize money was $10,000. And so, you know, I think that was amazing. And so anyway, having our baskets shown as art was really important, and still now. And so the Wee-Winnigan here on campus here at Colby College was the first kind of standalone Wabanaki art exhibition in a fine art museum. And, you know, so those were big moments. But another thing too that Jeremy had a goal for, and again, you know, this just like has opened up opportunities for others, was to be represented by a gallery in New York City. And again, I thought, wow, good luck with that. You know, like those guys don't even know we make baskets or, you know, anything about it. And here he is, you know, third year going on a fourth with being represented by Karma Galleries. So, I mean, you know, he really is a genius artistically and everything. And I do, you know, appreciate that he credits me with helping him with his professional development, but, you know, even he set goals that I thought were beyond, you know, what we could do as artists, basket makers. And again, I don't think our grandparents or great-grandparents would believe any of it.
Well, you mentioned the Santa Fe market. Your son Caleb won the Best of Basketry classification for his basket last year for a beautiful piece that is somewhere in the photos. I wonder, what does it mean to you to see him continuing in that tradition and making his own way with his work?
That is just like really amazing to me. Yeah, I think that there's a picture there, I think, too, of him in one of the workshops, because they used to drag him around to everything. And
paid off.
Yeah, right. But it was great too when he had his acceptance speech, you know, that he talked about growing up and, you know, a house that smelled of sweetgrass and watching me work, you know, because you always think, well, are you really teaching your kids anything, you know? What did you say to them today? But it's always like what you do, not so much what you say, right? And so he saw that and noted that. But he's fortunate. So he learned to make baskets with me when he was really young. But he's fortunate to be Jeremy Frey's apprentice. And so, yeah, that was a really exciting moment. Oh, there he is. There we are. And that's his basket. And again,
Beautiful.
Someone was in his booth at 4 a.m. in our booth. And so we're selling together again in the fall. I mean, in August. And it was so funny because I called him and I went to the booth at 5 a.m. and I said, you know, you better get up here. Someone's
Run.
here. But it is, again, he's competing with 1,000 artists and there's like 10 top prizes. So best of basketry, best of, you know, sculpture, best of painting. And I just told him, you know, I know, you know, you think you're a good basket maker and everything, but don't expect to win anything. You know, so... And he did,
Well,
so he's
I think you're a good motivator,
Yeah.
even if it's a little reverse psychology.
But you can also see Jeremy's influence in that. Anyone who knows his work can see.
We've touched on some of the museum shows here in Maine. You've, in your career, gotten involved in museum boards here at Colby, at the Portland Museum of Art, lent your expertise to exhibitions, including the exhibition that brought us together for the first time, the painted show at the Colby Art Museum in 2023. How do you think the institutional understanding of Wabanaki art has changed over time? And what do you think museums in Maine and across the country can do to improve their engagement with Native arts and Wabanaki artists?
Yeah, well, like I said, I think we've seen a really big change. And, you know, I am proud to be on the Museum Board of Governors here. And, you know, we're also here collecting a lot of underrepresented artists, you know, artists who were traditionally underrepresented here, and more women artists. And so, I mean, I think it goes all together like that. And yeah, the painted exhibition was really landmark, and a number of Pueblo advisors. And I really think that Colby and the PMA, Portland Museum of Art, where I'm a trustee, are really right on and doing as much as possible to be inclusive, of the art, of Wabanaki art in particular. And there's a great piece of Sarah Sockbeeson's in our permanent collection here that is a result of 10 years of her work of experimenting with found material. And I don't think I put a picture in here, I wish I had now, but like using recycled pieces. I think there's even like metal Venetian blinds in the piece. It's meant to, and looks like an ash basket, but it's not. It's all made of found and recycled materials. And so, yeah, I think there was a symposium at the Portland Museum of Art on Saturday about this very topic, and trying to encourage more people to go into the field of curating, more museum professionals. If you have more Indigenous museum professionals, there'll be really good representation there. And because I think we saw with the painted exhibition too, and the curator here, Sierra Height, did a fantastic job, but we really needed the Pueblo advisors to, help us, set it up and design it, and all the art was just really spectacular. But also in their worldview. I think it's really important. And Sarah Sockbeeson is actually curating an exhibition here at Colby that's going to open at the Paul Schuff Center in November. And so that's an area too where she's been a Lunder Institute Fellow here, and started as an artist in the collection, and then her art was shown here, Lunder Institute Fellow, and now she's learning about being a curator herself. And so I think it's like more of that.
Yeah. Is there anything that you think in particular museums and higher ed institutions in Maine could be doing to train Wabanaki artists in curating specifically?
Yeah, well, I do think that, maybe we could identify students in the University of Maine system, who are interested, and then they could come and intern here, hopefully, or Bowdoin College Museum of Art. And, I think that would really make sense and be important to have representation. That's the thing, is you want to hope that, it continues.
Yeah.
But we are in tough times for all of that right now, so, yeah.
We've talked a lot about some of these other artists, but I want to talk about your work. You've continued to make baskets, receive many honors over your own career. I think somewhere in here there's a photo of a basket that was acquired by the Met in New York. You've had prestigious prizes yourself. What ideas and techniques are you exploring today? Like, what's interesting to you in your work right now?
Well, most recently I've been working on pieces that are inspired by ecological and climate change concerns that I have, and just trying to see if I can express myself that way, and the things that I'm interested in. This is more like my traditional style. That's a sewing basket that I made, and then that's my great-grandmother holding a sewing basket made on the same wooden form. So I use all the same tools and wooden forms. But I don't know, I've had a lot of interest in, I think, some of my other pieces were up there that had to do with my climate change issues. And sturgeon basket, I made a basket that really kind of commemorated the return of the sturgeon to the Penobscot River. And that actually goes back to my work way back as a geologist with the Department of Natural Resources, because my former boss there, John Banks, was always working on Atlantic Salmon Federation, and our tribe had its own water quality, still does, lab, and worked really hard to help restore the Penobscot River and other water bodies, and still is. And so, just supporting some of that work that's gone on.
So in your sturgeon basket, can you walk me through a little bit of how the choices you made for that basket were connected to the ideas or to the sturgeon population, like in terms of colors or techniques?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm not sure if it was up there.
You'll have to go see it in person.
Yeah, you have to see it in person. It's in the Bowdoin College. And originally I was going to make something like a sewing basket, thinking like, because I still do really enjoy making the older styles, and I'm using the wooden forms and tools that were actually from my great-grandmother, and some were handed down to her. So they go back well into the 1800s, so I still like making those older styles too. But yeah, for the sturgeon one, I just, I guess I want to say is I got into this new area of working with museums and having an actual commission. And this is really new for Wabanaki artists to be invited to kind of weave what you wish, something that you're really interested in and that you want to make. Whereas before, I'm always weaving for the Indian markets, just like thinking about what is going to sell, when I get there. And as you can see, it is a part of what has helped keep our tradition alive too, with the selling. And so I'm having more time to use my own ideas and thoughts.
Can you walk us
Designs.
through what's the process of making a basket?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to buy my wood from a longtime Micmac basket maker who he and his son go and harvest the logs and pound the ash wood. And now my son is starting to get it for me, which is even better.
That's a real hookup right there.
Finally, yeah. I think there was a picture of him pounding a log there. But, so I'm lucky to have so many of those steps, involved already, done for me. And, really, I would say, it's just, for me, it's kind of a challenge to just have the studio time and quiet time and kind of sketch out what I want to make and think about, building upon a series. Like I have some ideas for some more in my climate change series. And, but yeah, it's about like cutting up the wood and dyeing it and braiding sweetgrass and a lot of those nominal tasks that, really sometimes you'd rather be playing pickleball, which is what I did today.
It was too nice out. You've talked about your interest in climate change and, more generally the environment. And we've touched a bit on the emerald ash borer that's threatening the trees that Wabanaki people have used for hundreds of years to make baskets. I'd love to hear a little bit about how are Native artists involved in the effort to save these trees, find alternative materials. What's happening right now with the emerald ash borer?
Yeah, that one's a really hard one. I mean, after working for, 21 years to save our own art form, and then a beetle comes, and is probably going to wipe things out, the whole resource for a while. We watched it coming even, like we were aware in 2003 that it had been found, and we knew about it way before it arrived here in 2018. Yeah, and this is a really dire looking map here. And so people are, going to conferences and things at the University of Maine, Orono. They have a task force, which is actually very good. And, I'm giving talks. I'm giving a talk at the Audubon next week. I think it's online. And just, but unfortunately, there's not a lot that can be done. Jeremy is cutting as much wood as possible, he said, and freezing it. And I'm filling a freezer with wood also that I'm buying pre-processed and rolled, like I said, from my suppliers. And that will help keep the material, for use. But, a lot of the focus on the conference in the fall at the University of Maine at Orono, because it's the premier forestry school, and they're looking at and they're trying to come up with solutions. But the focus is on people really glom on to saving seeds, which is great. But my son will be 93 when that seed is an ash tree for a basket maker. So quite a few years ago, we did go out with a number of, and they're mostly gone now, the guys who know how to harvest the ash, what constitutes a good ash tree, what the habitat is like, and it kind of all the secrets of that too in the forest, because only one brown ash tree out of 100 is going to be a good basket tree. It's going to be straight enough. It's going to have the grain that you need. And so we captured a bunch of that knowledge from all guys in all 4 tribes, and it's archived at the National Museum of the American Indian for future generations of basket makers in our tribes to access. Because that's going to be the issue is, are there people who even have that knowledge? How do we leave that knowledge behind? So that's really what we're focused on is, it's not, and I guess, as far as we have heard from the Maine Forest Service and the U.S. Forest Service, there will be pockets of places in Maine where the wood will survive, small pockets, where people can't go, where they aren't transporting firewood, because that's how it spreads.
Yeah, I wonder, are there things that that the average Mainer can do to help prevent the spread or stop the spread?
Well, that's the whole thing, yeah. It's just the movement of the wood. And most people don't know, like, there's a quarantine on, so, like, you're not even supposed to be moving firewood that contains any ash, like, anywhere in any of those areas right now. And a lot of people don't know about it. I think it's just not, advertised enough, in my opinion. But, I live on a beautiful lake in Farmington, and the road is, lined with ash trees, and those trees will all be dead.
Wow.
We saw it in Connecticut, where my stepdaughter is, and we were there visiting the family, and, 2 years later, it was all stumps. And that was like the Dutch elm disease, too. When I was growing up in South Portland, we'd go down to the penny candy store and get our popsicles and stuff under the big elm tree shade, and the next year we were sitting on the big stumps eating our popsicles, And so it is that dire. Now, people with prize ash trees in their yards can get insecticide and apply and save those trees. So I've been advising my friends who have ash trees in their yard.
Scouting them out in all of your yards.
And so it's all ash species, not just the brown or black ash that we use for basket making. And I would call the Maine Forest Service, because they'll give you all the information on who to contact, who can do that.
You mentioned in your own work that you're trying as much as possible maybe to freeze ash so you have access to it. Are there other ways in which this crisis is impacting your own work, or that you're thinking about it in terms of the future of your own practice?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my baskets are smaller now. For one thing, I have a new supply right now, so I'm feeling better about that. But last fall, I was making just smaller pieces, thinking I want to stretch this out, and it's very stressful. Yeah, it's really, but I'm also starting to look at new materials, use other materials. There are no other woods that would do what the ash does. We're asked that all the time. And I coined this term that ash is the silk of the basket woods. And you could never do those points and things that Jeremy does and all that precision work with. I mean, when he's weaving some of his baskets, the skinniest parts of it are the narrowest widths are like 1/32 of an inch, and you couldn't cut any other wood that fine with the gauges that we use and stuff.
Are there alternative materials that you think are more promising?
I don't know. I mean, it's just not the same.
Yeah.
The thing is, even the stories that. There's a couple different origin stories, Wabanaki origin stories, but a really prominent one is that the culture hero, Gluskabe, shot an arrow into the tree. And from that tree is where the Penobscot people and Passamaquoddy people came. And so there's not really many alternatives. That's one of my climate change, and that talks about the what and why. And that's in the Portland Museum of Art. And that was really funny, because they sent that piece around on Twitter because they were so happy that someone was helping them talk about climate change with art. But they do that at the Bigelow Labs. They have outdoor installations, and they have visiting artists. And so I find that really fun and interesting.
Yeah. You've talked about the relationship of, for example, the ash tree to the Wabanaki origin story, and this long tradition. I wonder how you see this art relating to the ongoing conversation about tribal sovereignty in Maine.
Well, I think I just always point to that photograph of my great-grandmother, selling her baskets and, on the table in front, and just, think about the economic self-sufficiency, of the artists. And I just think that, the artists can play a key role in that, and just, making art as, a sovereign statement, as of, the distinct people and the distinct value systems that Wabanaki people hold, and also, for the economic self-sufficiency that you're practicing sovereignty by doing that even, and so I think there's just a lot of different ways to talk about that and look at that word.
We've talked a lot about, the effort to save this traditional practice, this endangered practice. What do you see as the future for this iconic art?
Well, I'm hoping that, I'm teaching some apprentices still, and one is my cousin, and she's teaching her granddaughter, and so that's really good to think about, that the work will continue and that people will still have access to the wood. I think artists like Jeremy and, his brother Gabriel and Sarah and Sakvisen and Geo Soktoma have really made, marks in the art markets, and, for having, getting our work in museums and getting our work in, places of prominence and for the marketing. But, I'm definitely concerned, because of some of the funding structures and some of the interest in the work. I'm hoping it continues, but, just not sure. I'm really kind of, concerned about a lot of, what's going on politically, and, people not understanding, the art form and sort of its importance. So,
yeah,
time will
especially
tell.
at this dire moment for funding for the arts.
Exactly. Yeah, we could not have saved our own art form in this climate today. And I have to share, and I showed this at the symposium the other day, it was kind of funny, but in Portland in 1995, when I was invited to serve on the State Arts Commission, the Maine Arts Commission, and I was actually sworn in by Governor McKernan, and it was my first meeting there. And I was waiting outside, and it was this whole thing, like you're gonna go in and be introduced as the new commission member. And this woman came out who had recommended me, and she said, they wanna know why they're sending money up to a bunch of Indians making baskets in the woods. And I was like, oh my God. So then to see 30 years later, Jeremy Frey woven in that building almost next door to that building that was set at was so rewarding to me, to say, well, that's why. Money was well spent.
Yeah.
But that seed money and things to encourage arts and culture now is, I'm afraid, I'm really worried about it. That is it going to be there, and are, children going to be encouraged even to explore making art? I don't know. It's just, like I said, that's Caleb, and working with Jeremy.
You have been, in the midst of fellowships yourself in the last year or two. And I wonder if you might share a little bit about how that's impacted you as an artist, your practice, how you're feeling about like the state of the arts generally, and basketry in Maine.
Well, it's really been nice, of course. I mean, the total was over 100,000 with those fellowship that you mentioned. So it gives me the freedom, to come and talk with you here at night, not have to be home making my baskets now. But
Thank you to the Ruth Foundation.
Right, but no, it's it's really good to be able to have that freedom, not always thinking about like, oh, I have to make something that is going to sell, rather than something that I'm thinking about or want to experiment with, materials and try something different. But yeah, I think that's really, I'm definitely grateful and honored for all the recognition. I have to share with you though how funny it was, because my family, I have, still 4 brothers, and they're like, so why are you in the paper all the time? this kept showing up, that I was going to be speaking with Megan. And they're like, should we come to that? And I'm like, no, don't worry about it. It's just really hilarious. And then, as I told you, I thought we were going to be in a little studio here. You said, I want to interview you, Theresa. And I'm like, okay. So I'm thinking we're going to be in a studio, and it's a podcast. And then my cousin sends me this thing in the newspaper.
Here we are.
I said, okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm grateful that you
too.
did, and I'm grateful that maybe your brothers aren't here, because as someone with also 3 siblings, I know that they can be hecklers. And we're about to open it up for audience questions.
All right.
So I wonder if you have a question for Theresa in the last few minutes of our time together, if you might raise your hand, and
I'm going to come around with a mic, so please wait until I come to you so that the
Awesome.
people who are watching the live stream can hear your question also.
Thanks, Strawberry.
Hi. I was just wondering what the demographics, or I guess more, what's the breakdown for male versus female basket weavers?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I've, traveled a lot in the West and everything, and, it's different everywhere. But in our tribes here in Maine, it's about half and half.
It is. Okay.
Yeah, and traditionally the men made what are so-called the work baskets, or like the pack basket that you saw, that piece. And then that's another thing, again, with Jeremy, that his grandfather made those baskets, and he wanted to be more creative and more artistic pieces. So, yeah, because the men get the wood, and process it. But they've always been involved in Maine, in the hunting and fishing especially. A lot of people have those pack baskets, to keep ice fishing traps in and things. That's where I grew up. My husband has one that he inherited from his father.
Wow.
He still uses it for ice fishing, and potato baskets, and then women making the so-called fancy baskets.
Do you still see that sort of tradition in play?
There still is that, kind of division. And that other style evolved kind of in the Victorian times. And there were baskets for everything in the house in Bar Harbor, where there were baskets little woven rings that held your napkins, that held your combs, waste baskets, everything, So they were making baskets for the big houses on the coast. And Squirrel Island, I was saying with Megan earlier, I was at Squirrel Island and a few years ago. And Deer Isle, I've seen it too, in Bar Harbor, where people have these baskets in the houses, and they don't even remember where they came from. They've inherited them like from 4 and sometimes probably 5 generations, but they treasure them. So it's really cool to see.
There we go.
I have 2 unrelated questions. One is, what possessed you to go to Wisconsin and study geology? And the other question is brown and black ash that local that you can't find it somewhere else to import, that the ash borer is not affecting it yet?
Yeah, good question. Well, so, I don't know. I think probably growing up with those brothers, I was just outside all the time, and I was interested in a lot of things in the natural world growing up. And I went to the University of Southern Maine for my first degree, undeclared, and somehow ended up in a geology class with a great professor. My father bought me a rock hammer, took me rock collecting. He took me rock collecting over in the Western Maine pegmatite belt, and became interested, and so went to Wisconsin for that, for grad school. My degree is actually in economic geology, which is mineral and mineral assessment, mineral exploration. And so that's what I did for my tribe right after the land claim. But what was the other question?
About,
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Say that again.
whether the ash trees are local to Maine or whether there are other places they can
Yeah,
come from.
well, we're almost, in terms of the US, we're almost kind of the last place where it has reached. And so, short of going to Canada, but we're also almost at the Northern Range too. So there's not a lot of ash trees that are not affected already. Like, we sent, I think there was a picture of Jeremy from like 15 years ago. We sent the next generation of basket makers out to Wisconsin and to the Mohawk Nation to see what it was like to lose the ash trees. I don't know if that traumatized him or not, but we thought they were going to be the next leaders, and we wanted them to know, that they were going to have this to deal with. And so we've been watching it for a long time. And I have to say, I was completely devastated in the fall at the big conference at the University of Maine at Orono to hear from the U.S. Forest Service that the place where it began in Ohio is now reinfected. So it actually left, and new trees were growing, and it's back. And I couldn't wrap my head around that, because those of you from Maine, probably remember, if you're my age or older, the Dutch elm disease. And it swept through, and it kept going, and then it was over. And this is, I just couldn't even believe when they said that. Yeah. So it's going to be a whole, mourning, too, period of loss.
So following up on exactly that point, my question was, I know you've been all over the country helping people with, marketing basketry and everything. And have you found people that have found other trees or other products that work that could replace the ash?
No, the Cherokees weave with oak, and those are beautiful baskets, but they actually there's a woman who started importing our ash wood to weave because it's such a better and easier wood to weave with. So, and there was I knew some Micmac family. He was actually the president, Donald Santapass. Him and I basically were the incorporators of the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance together. He used to weave with maple and things, but it wasn't preferred. Again, when you look at the baskets, especially that, Jeremy weaves, you cannot do that with any other kind of wood.
I remember sitting in Jeremy's studio, interviewing him, and we talked for a full hour, and he spent the entire hour splitting ash,
Right.
separating it into pieces, and it would just fall into these flexible, beautiful curls. And it just seemed so delicate and
Beautiful.
bendable and beautiful. And I was very mesmerized by the mounting pile of ash. And it was just the beginning of stripping it down to thinner
Right.
pieces that he would go so much smaller than that to braid them, in finer braids than you could braid in my hair, for example. It was incredible, and gave me, I think, more of a sense than I had of the unique quality of the wood.
Yeah, I was just going to point out the gauges on the right. And
Yeah.
those gauges have little watch spring or clock spring blades in them. And that's what we cut the wood with. And those are actually antiques that belong to me. One of them has a face in it, which I think is remarkable. And you can see actually where my great-grandmother's thumb was
Oh my gosh.
on the front part. But those are the things that will then take those strips that have been split. Like the growth ring can be split multiple times, and then a lot of times it has to be scraped as well because there'll be a rough side. And then we take those little hand gauges and pull the wood over the gauge and make, really skinny widths or wider, like 1/2 inch or whatever for the ribs of the basket. And I'm impressed. Jeremy is teaching my son, and he only uses a knife. And I've used scissors for a long time, which is considered cheating, but
We
so
won't
it's
tell.
really skilled. Yeah, I think some people are really good at it. I will say, I think Caleb took to it really easily. But Jeremy's such a hard worker too. It's funny when I talk to him, weekly or whatever, and I can always hear him working. I can hear him slitting. I know what he's doing too, and I can hear him when he's shaving the splints, and then I can hear when he's like weaving on a basket. I can hear the snap of the wood on the wooden form, so I can tell what he's doing. And as I was trying to guess it like a game, and I'll say, "What are you doing now?" I'll say, "Yep, knew it."
I think we've got a question over there.
You're speaking about the existential loss or potential loss of the black ash and how it's going to impact what you do and how you bond with your own people. Can you speak a little bit about the spirituality of making a basket and what it becomes for you? And I always find it interesting, because I don't understand it, how you can let go of it, how they can be sold. I know they're utilitarian and they have to provide an income. I understand that, but there must be a connection to them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're weaving, it's really meditative and, on the practice side of it. But certainly, I think I really first started weaving, too, to be closer to, like, my great-grandmother and my ancestors and stuff. Like, I knew my great-grandmother and watched her making baskets, but, when you're young, you just don't expect someone to not always be there. And so when I went to learn, and I had to learn from a younger friend of hers, and, hearing the language, there's so much to it that is really rich. And, like you said, that spiritual connection. Like, I saw a video that was 20 years old that we took, and Jeremy was pounding a log at the Passamaquoddy community, and all these people were speaking Passamaquoddy. And it was just gave me chills, because I forgot how much of that there was, that the late, great Molly Neptune Parker, who was our longtime president, she was a great basket maker. And the other thing, too, is that, my teacher told me, and I still haven't mastered it, is that you'll never really be truly proficient in basketry. I mean, she didn't use that word, until you can learn to weave in the language. And so there's really things that don't translate, that you're not going to really understand and fully weave into your piece if you're not, like, having those sayings. And so I know bits and pieces of things, but that's all. And that's some work I've tried to do, is to get, deeper in that language connection, because I think that's where a lot of the spiritual connection is, too, in the languages.
I think we've got a question over there.
Yes. I attended the Jeremy's showing at the Portland Art Museum last summer, and my family has always said that there was Indian blood in the family, but we never had any proof. I did Ancestry a few years ago, and I found where it came from. When I went to the exhibit, I have 2 baskets that I got from my grandmother, who came from her great-grandmother, and I'm just wondering, at least that's the story I was told, is there anybody that duplicates those, that it wouldn't be authentic, or is there any place where I can bring them to have them looked at by someone who makes them? And I actually have them with me. I came from Florida to do this. We have a summer place in Maine that we sold last year, and the last thing I went to was that exhibit before I left. And then when I saw the piece, I subscribed to the Portland Press Herald. When I saw the exhibit was going to be here, we were coming up for my granddaughter's, she's got a doctorate in nursing from the University of Massachusetts Medical School this weekend. And I brought the baskets to see if I could find out anything about them.
I mean, if you sent pictures to me, I could look at them. Like, you could Google my website and send me a message through there.
Okay. And I have pictures of a basket that you wove that was in Jeremy's exhibit. It's identical.
Okay, interesting. Sure.
I know we're close to time, so we got time for one more question. Yes.
Maybe while Strawberry is bringing the mic over, be a good moment to tell folks that we have a little flyer. So if you're interested in seeing baskets, attending markets, check out the flyer.
Yeah, so there'll be basket makers at most of these events. So the Wabanaki Art Market. I think Strawberry's pass some of these out.
Yeah, grab one of
Extras
those.
in the back. And so, like the one in December will be like the 31st or 32nd annual, December 13th. There'll be a lot of basket makers at that one in particular.
All right, the mic has made it to you.
Hello. I'm a gallery educator along with my fellow gallery educators here at the museum. And we have the very special privilege of teaching baskets to Maine public youth. And I just need to say that it's such a beautiful experience to be able to not only allow them to touch baskets that have been made by Indigenous artists here, but also to just educate them and show them that the culture is surviving. And we do talk to them about the brown ash. And I was just wondering if there's anything, because I haven't met you or talked to you about this personally, that you would like for us to include in our content when we do have these experiences with children who've maybe never even heard about Indigenous people, for example, and we get to go as deep as showing them these traditional and more modern techniques.
Boy, that's a big question for the end.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think it would be good to, try to visit, one of the markets and maybe, I don't know, that's a lot to say, but I mean, I know the Common Ground Fair used to have people come in buses to go to the tent there and try to meet basket makers and, or maybe the tribal museums too.
I think one of the things that that we often talk about when we talk about basketry is also just that this is the oldest art form in Maine, and that's such a beautiful thing that you are always reminding me of and sharing. And I think it's cool to know that there are students who are engaging with that today.
Yeah, really pleased to hear that. Thank you.
Well, I think that might be our time. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thanks for
Thank you to
coming.
Theresa.
Thank you.